Caleb Rowan had buried one wife already. He wouldn't bury another. But as the stagecoach crested the Montana hillside, carrying a stranger who'd agreed to marry him sight unseen, he wondered if grief had driven him mad. His sons needed a mother. His ranch needed steady hands. And he needed someone who wouldn't ask him to love again. The advertisement had been simple: widower seeking practical woman. No romance required. When Eliza Moore stepped down onto his land with fear bright in her eyes and secrets folded in her suitcase, Caleb realized some bargains cost more than money. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because this is a story about what happens when two broken people stop running from the past and start building a future. The May wind carried the scent of sage and rain across the Rowan Ranch, sweeping through yellow grasslands that stretched toward mountains still wearing caps of snow. Caleb stood on the porch of his timber house, one hand braced against the post he'd notched himself 7 years ago when hope still lived in his chest. The wood was smooth now, worn by weather and worry, by the countless times he'd gripped it while watching storms roll in or waiting for hands that never came home. Today, he was waiting for a different kind of storm. The boys were inside, supposedly doing their lessons. More likely, Thomas was staring out the window while James pretended to read, both of them watching the road with the same nervous anticipation that twisted in Caleb's gut. He'd tried to explain it to them in terms they'd understand, that the woman coming wasn't replacing their mother, wasn't trying to take anything from them. She was just someone who needed a place, same as they needed help. Thomas, at 8, had nodded solemnly. James, barely 6, had asked if she liked horses. Caleb hadn't known how to answer. He didn't know anything about Eliza Moore except what she'd written in 2 brief letters, that she was 26, capable, and had reasons for leaving Philadelphia that she'd explain in person. The advertisement he'd placed had been equally sparse. Mrs. Gunderson at the Mercantile had encouraged him to add something warm, something inviting, but Caleb had kept it honest. Widower with 2 sons seeking practical woman for household management and child rearing. Ranch in Bitterroot Valley. No romantic expectations. 3 women had responded. One letter had been flowery and desperate, full of declarations about new beginnings and God's providence that made his jaw tight. Another had included a list of requirements that would have been reasonable for a railroad baron's wife, but seemed unlikely for a working ranch. Eliza's letter had been different, simple, direct. Mr. Rowan, I read your advertisement with interest. I am 26 years old, unmarried, and experienced in household management. I can cook, sew, and manage accounts. I am healthy and accustomed to hard work. I have no family requiring me to remain in Philadelphia, and I am prepared to travel west immediately if you find my qualifications acceptable. I should be forthright. I am not seeking romance or affection. I am seeking security and purpose. If those terms are acceptable to you, I will commit myself fully to your household and the care of your sons. I await your response, Eliza Moore. Something in those words had settled the matter. Not the qualifications, though those were practical enough, but the honesty. The clear understanding that this was a transaction, not a love story. Caleb had enough ghosts in his house without adding the specter of false hope. He'd sent money for her passage and a brief reply confirming the arrangement. Her second letter had been even shorter, stating only her arrival date and requesting no one meet her in town. She'd hire a wagon to bring her to the ranch. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now the dust cloud on the eastern road announced her arrival. Caleb's hand tightened on the porch post. Behind him, the front door creaked open and small footsteps shuffled across the planks. Thomas appeared at his left side, skinny shoulders squared with the false bravery of a boy trying to be a man. James pressed against his right, small fingers catching the fabric of Caleb's shirt. "Is that her, Pa?" James whispered. "I expect so." "What if she's mean?" Thomas asked, voicing the fear that had circled through the house since Caleb first told them what he'd done. Caleb looked down at his eldest son, seeing Sarah's sharp chin and careful eyes in the boy's face. The resemblance used to hurt like a knife between his ribs. Now it was just another ache he'd learned to carry. "Then we'll manage," he said. "Same as we always do." But his heart hammered against his ribs as the wagon rolled into the yard, dust swirling in the late afternoon sun. The driver was Bill Henderson, who ran freight between the valley settlements. He pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down, tipping his hat to Caleb before moving to help his passenger. For a moment, Caleb saw only the silhouette, a woman's shape against bright sky, skirts and a traveling cloak, a single piece of luggage. Then she stepped clear of the wagon's shadow and became real. Eliza Moore was not what he'd expected, though he couldn't have said what he'd been expecting. She was neither beautiful nor plain, but something in between that made her hard to dismiss. Dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was all clean angles, sharp cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth pressed thin with either determination or fear. Her eyes were the color of winter rivers, pale and clear, and they found Caleb's face with a directness that was almost challenging. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, mended at the cuffs and collar. No jewelry except a small brooch at her throat. Her hands, clutching a worn carpet bag, were bare of rings but marked with small scars, evidence of work, of a life that hadn't been gentle. She studied him with the same careful assessment he was giving her, and in that moment of mutual evaluation, Caleb felt the weight of what they were attempting. Two strangers binding themselves by law and necessity, hoping desperation was foundation enough for a household. Bill Henderson cleared his throat. "Brought your mail-order bride safe and sound, Caleb. Not a problem the whole journey." "I'm grateful to you, Bill." Caleb stepped off the porch, conscious of the boys trailing behind him like uncertain shadows. He stopped a respectful distance from Eliza, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to give her space. "Miss Moore, welcome to the Rowan Ranch." "Mr. Rowan." Her voice was lower than he'd anticipated, steady but not warm. Philadelphia accent, though not the refined sort, something rougher at the edges. "Thank you for arranging my passage." An awkward silence stretched between them. Bill shifted his weight, clearly hoping for an invitation inside, or at least some entertainment from this peculiar situation. When none came, he touched his hat again. "I'll leave you folks to get acquainted. Payment's already settled, Caleb, so I'll be on my way." "Appreciated, Bill." The freight driver climbed back onto his wagon and clucked to the horses, leaving them standing in a yard that suddenly felt too quiet, too exposed. Eliza's gaze moved past Caleb to the boys, and something in her expression shifted, softened, perhaps, though it was hard to tell. "These are my sons," Caleb said, gesturing them forward with what he hoped was encouraging. "Thomas is 8, James is 6. Thomas stepped forward first, executing an awkward bow that Mrs. Gunderson must have taught him during their occasional trips to town. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am." James hung back, half hidden behind Caleb's leg, peeking around with wide eyes. Eliza bent slightly, bringing herself closer to their level. "Hello, Thomas. James." She didn't reach for them, didn't try to force closeness. Instead, she simply offered a small nod. "I hope we'll become friends." James ducked completely behind Caleb. Thomas studied her with solemn intensity. "They're shy," Caleb said, then immediately regretted it. Explaining his children to this stranger felt like weakness. "They'll warm up. I don't expect otherwise." Eliza straightened, her attention returning to him. "I'm sure this arrangement is strange for all of us. I don't wish to impose on your household more than necessary." "You're not imposing. You're—" He stopped, unsure how to finish. "Not a guest. Not exactly family. Something unnamed that existed in the space between transaction and belonging." She saved him from having to find words. "Perhaps you could show me where I'll be staying. Then we can discuss the household arrangements and my responsibilities." Practical. Direct. Exactly what her letters had promised. "Of course." Caleb picked up her bag, surprisingly light for a woman who'd traveled across the country, and led her toward the house. The boys followed at a distance, whispering to each other in voices too low to hear. The house had been Sarah's pride once, built solid from timber and stone with real glass windows and a covered porch that caught the evening breeze. She'd sewn curtains, planted flowers, filled it with the small touches that made a structure feel like home. After she died, those touches had faded. The curtains grew dusty. The flowers withered. The house remained functional but hollow, like a body missing its soul. Eliza paused at the threshold, taking in the main room with its stone fireplace, long table, and worn furniture. Her expression revealed nothing. No judgment, no disappointment, no relief, just careful observation. It's clean, she said, which Caleb supposed was a compliment. We manage. He set her bag down and gestured toward the hallway. 3 bedrooms. The boys share one. I'm in the largest. The third is yours. She followed him down the hall, footsteps light on the plank floor. He pushed open the door to what had been Sarah's sewing room, later a catch-all for things he couldn't bear to look at or throw away. He'd spent the last week cleaning it out, boxing up fabric and thread and half-finished projects, hauling out the broken chair and cracked mirror. What remained was sparse: a narrow bed with a simple frame, a small dresser, a window facing east toward the mountains. Eliza stepped inside, moving to the window. Her fingers touched the glass lightly, tracing the view. It's quiet here. Sometimes too quiet. The words escaped before he could stop them, revealing more than he'd intended. She turned to face him, and in the afternoon light slanting through that window, he saw something flicker across her face. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. The look of someone who knew about silence that weighed too heavy. Mr. Rowan, she said carefully, I want to be clear about my expectations, and I hope you'll be clear about yours. I came here seeking security and purpose. I will work hard. I will care for your sons as if they were my own. I will maintain your household to the best of my ability. What I cannot promise is affection or sentiment. This is a practical arrangement, and I intend to approach it practically. Caleb felt something in his chest ease. That suits me fine. I'm not looking for romance or a replacement for... He stopped, unable to say her name aloud. For what I lost. I need someone capable and steady, someone the boys can depend on. Then we understand each other. I suppose we do. They stood in that small room with its bare walls and simple furniture, 2 people binding themselves to a future neither could quite envision, held together by need and hope and the desperate prayer that sometimes practical was enough. I'll let you settle in, Caleb said, backing toward the door. Supper's at 6. Nothing fancy. I'll show you the kitchen and pantry tomorrow. Let you take over as you're comfortable. I can start immediately if you prefer. Tomorrow's soon enough. He paused in the doorway. Miss Moore? I'm grateful you came. Whatever your reasons, however this works out, I want you to know that. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the careful composure. Thank you, Mr. Rowan. That means more than you might expect. He left her there and returned to the main room, where the boys had stationed themselves on the sofa, watching the hallway like sentries. James scrambled up immediately, pressing close. Is she staying, Pa? She's staying. Forever? Thomas asked, that careful word carrying the weight of a boy who'd learned that forever was a promise the world didn't always keep. Caleb ran his hand through Thomas's hair, feeling the familiar ache of love tangled with worry. We'll see, son. For now, she's here, and we're going to make her feel welcome. Understood? Both boys nodded, though uncertainty lingered in their eyes. The evening that followed was stilted and strange, full of careful politeness and long silences. Eliza emerged from her room wearing the same gray dress, hair still pulled back severely, and helped Caleb prepare supper without being asked. She moved through this kitchen with quiet efficiency, finding things by logic, plates in the cabinet, utensils in the drawer, salt and pepper above the stove. She didn't ask unnecessary questions or make small talk. She simply worked. The boys watched from the doorway until Caleb sent them to wash up. When they returned, the table was set and simple food laid out. Fried potatoes, beans, biscuits that Caleb had made that morning and Eliza had warmed. Not fancy, but solid. They ate in near silence, broken only by the scrape of forks and the boys' whispered conversation. Eliza took small bites, her attention moving between the window and her plate. Once, James asked her if she liked horses, and she answered that she hadn't been around them much but was willing to learn. Thomas asked if she knew how to play checkers. She said she did. Small exchanges, testing the waters of this new arrangement. After supper, Eliza cleared the table without being asked while Caleb sent the boys to prepare for bed. When he returned to the kitchen, he found her washing dishes at the basin, working with the same methodical efficiency she'd shown earlier. You don't have to start tonight, he said. I prefer to stay busy. She didn't look at him, focusing on the plate in her hands. Idle hands make for troubled thoughts. Caleb understood that better than he cared to admit. How many nights had he worked past exhaustion just to avoid lying awake in an empty bed, listening to the house creak and settle around him? He picked up a dish towel and began drying what she'd washed. They worked in tandem, a rhythm developing without discussion. Her wash, his dry, both of them careful not to touch. When the last dish was put away, Eliza dried her hands and turned to face him. "I should warn you," she said quietly, "that I sometimes have nightmares. I don't know if walls here are thick enough to keep sound from carrying, but I thought you should know in case you hear anything during the night." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and brave. "I appreciate the warning," Caleb said, matching her tone. "Same courtesy? I'm often up early. I'll try to be quiet, but ranch work starts with the sun." "That's fine. I'm accustomed to early rising." Another silence, this one less awkward than contemplative. Outside, the spring evening was fading into dusk, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. An owl called from somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek. "Miss Moore," Caleb began, then stopped, realizing how formal it sounded for two people who were supposed to build a household together. "Would it be acceptable to call you Eliza? And you should call me Caleb. The formality seems unnecessary," she finished. "Yes, I agree." "Eliza, then." "Caleb." She tested his name carefully, as if checking its weight. Then she offered him something that might have been a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good night." "Good night." He watched her walk down the hall to her room, heard the soft click of her door closing. Then he checked on the boys, who were both pretending to sleep while clearly listening to every sound in the house. He kissed their foreheads, James accepting it naturally, Thomas tolerating it with the dignity of a boy trying to outgrow such things, and retreated to his own room. The bed was too large, as it had been for 3 years. The house settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere down the hall, Eliza Moore was lying in a narrow bed in a strange house, beginning a life she'd chosen out of desperation or hope, or some combination of both. Caleb stared at the ceiling and wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The first week passed in a strange dance of proximity and distance. Eliza kept to herself when not actively working, spending her free hours in her room or walking the perimeter of the ranch yard. She didn't explore beyond the immediate grounds, didn't ask questions about the land or the neighbors or anything personal. She simply moved through each day with quiet determination, learning the household's rhythms and establishing her own. She was a better cook than Caleb, not fancy, but competent and efficient. Meals improved from barely edible to genuinely satisfying. The house developed a smell beyond dust and old smoke, bread baking, coffee brewing, something green and growing from the herbs she'd found dried in the pantry and begun using. The boys orbited her uncertainly, drawn by curiosity, but held back by loyalty to a mother they barely remembered. Thomas watched her with Sarah's careful eyes, cataloging everything. James was more open, occasionally forgetting himself and chattering about his day before remembering she was still a stranger and falling silent. Eliza never pushed. She answered when spoken to, offered help when needed, but didn't force affection or familiarity. She existed in their space without demanding space of her own. On the 4th day, Caleb came in from morning chores to find her standing at the kitchen counter, staring at something in her hands. As he approached, he saw it was Sarah's apron, the blue one with yellow flowers that he hadn't been able to throw away but couldn't bear to see. "I found it in the drawer," Eliza said quietly, not looking at him. "I thought I should ask before I—" "It's fine." The words came out rougher than he intended. "It's just an apron. Use what you need." She set it down instead, choosing a plain white one hanging on a hook. "I don't wish to use things that carry weight." Caleb felt something twist in his chest. Gratitude, maybe, or relief. "I appreciate that." They didn't speak about it again, but that evening he took Sarah's apron from the drawer and folded it carefully into the box of her things he kept in the barn. Not forgotten, but not haunting the house anymore. On the 6th day, catastrophe arrived in the form of James falling from the hayloft. Caleb was mending fence in the north pasture when Thomas came running, face pale with terror, shouting that James was hurt. He dropped everything and ran, heart hammering, mind already cataloging the worst possibilities. By the time he reached the barn, Eliza was already there, kneeling beside James in the dirt, her hands moving over him with surprising competence. "Where does it hurt?" she was asking, voice calm despite the blood on James's forehead. "My arm," James sobbed. "Pup! I'm here." Caleb dropped to his knees beside them, forcing himself to breathe, to think. James's left arm hung at a wrong angle. Broken, clearly. But he was conscious, crying, breathing, alive. "We need to splint it before we move him," Eliza said, looking at Caleb directly. "Do you have—" "In the house. First aid box under the kitchen counter." He couldn't believe how steady her voice was, how her hands didn't shake. She nodded to Thomas. "Can you get it? Quickly, but carefully." Thomas ran. Eliza turned her attention back to James, using her apron to wipe blood from his face. "You're going to be fine," she told him, gentle but firm. "Your arm is broken, which means it will hurt for a while, but it will heal. Do you understand?" James nodded through tears. "Good. You're being very brave." Thomas returned with the box. Eliza worked quickly, using cloth and wooden slats to stabilize James's arm while Caleb held his son in murmured comfort. When it was done, they carried him to the house and settled him on the sofa. Eliza cleaned the cut on his forehead, not deep enough for stitches, thank God, and bandaged it carefully. "We should take him to Doc Pritchard in town," she said. "Make sure the bone is set correctly." "Tomorrow morning," Caleb agreed. "First light." That night, James couldn't sleep for the pain. Caleb sat with him, exhausted and helpless, until Eliza appeared in the doorway wearing a simple nightdress with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, hair loose for the first time since she'd arrived. "Let me," she said quietly. Caleb was too tired to argue. He retreated to the kitchen, listening as Eliza settled into the chair beside James's bed. Her voice drifted through the house, low and rhythmic, telling a story about a boy who fell from the sky and landed in a garden where everything grew upside down. Fantasy and nonsense that made James giggle despite his pain. When Caleb checked on them, an hour later, James was asleep and Eliza was still sitting there, keeping watch. "You should rest," Caleb whispered from the doorway. "So should you." He moved into the room, keeping his voice low. "Thank you for today. You knew what to do." "My father was a surgeon." She said it flatly, like it meant nothing. "I spent time in his practice before he died. I learned some things. More pieces of the puzzle that was Eliza Moore. I'm glad you were here." She looked up at him then, and in the dim light from the hallway, he saw exhaustion in her face. And something else, fear that had been carefully controlled all day, now showing at the edges. "I was terrified," she admitted. "When I heard Thomas shouting, when I saw the blood, I thought, but you didn't freeze. You did what needed doing." "Yes." She turned her attention back to James, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. "I've had practice at doing what needs doing." Caleb wanted to ask what she meant. What circumstances had required that kind of strength? But this didn't feel like the time for questions. Instead, he pulled a second chair over and sat down across from her. "I'll take the next watch," he said. "We can both stay." So they sat together in the quiet house, two near strangers keeping vigil over a sleeping child, bound by purpose, if not yet by trust. Somewhere in those small hours, Caleb realized that whatever transaction he'd thought he was entering, it had already begun transforming into something more complicated. Dr. Pritchard confirmed the break was clean and reset the bone properly, praising Eliza's splinting work and giving instructions for care. James bore it stoically, earning a peppermint stick for his bravery. On the ride home, he fell asleep against Eliza's shoulder, and she didn't move him even when her arm must have gone numb. Thomas, who'd been quiet all morning, finally spoke. "You knew what to do." Eliza glanced at him. "I did. She knew things too, about healing and such. Your mother sounds like she was very capable." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "She'd be glad you were here, yesterday, for James." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, throat suddenly tight. Eliza's voice was soft when she replied, "That's kind of you to say, Thomas." That afternoon, while James napped under Eliza's watchful eye, Caleb and Thomas worked together on afternoon chores. His eldest was unusually talkative, asking questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about plans for summer. Normal questions that Caleb answered readily, grateful for the distraction. Then, as they were hauling water to the vegetable garden, Thomas stopped and looked up at him. Pa, is she going to stay? I expect so, unless she decides otherwise. Do you want her to stay? Caleb set down the bucket, considering how to answer honestly without making promises he couldn't keep. I think she's good for us, for the house, for you and James. What about for you? Sometimes his son's perception cut too deep. For me too, Caleb admitted. It's been a long time since anyone else carried the weight around here. It helps. Thomas nodded slowly, processing this. She's not Ma. No, she's not. But maybe that's okay? Caleb pulled his son close, pressing a kiss to his head. Maybe that's exactly right. That evening, after supper was cleared and James was settled for the night, Caleb found Eliza on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire. She'd brought out the rocking chair from the corner, Sarah's chair, though he tried not to think of it that way, and sat with her hands folded in her lap. He hesitated, then settled onto the porch steps, giving her space. James is sleeping well, she said. The pain seems to be manageable. Thanks to you. She was quiet for a moment. I was thinking about what Thomas said, about his mother. Caleb waited, uncertain where this was leading. I don't want to replace her, Eliza continued. I couldn't even if I tried. But I also don't want to be a ghost in this house, living around the edges of a life that belongs to someone else. She paused. I don't know how to navigate that. The honesty in her words struck him. Neither do I, he admitted. Sarah's been gone 3 years, but sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times it feels like another life entirely. I don't know what I'm supposed to keep and what I'm supposed to let go. Perhaps you're not supposed to do either. Perhaps you just live and let things find their own place. Is that what you're doing? Finding your own place? She turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her face was softer than he'd seen it. I'm trying. It's not easy, coming into a life half-built. But I'm trying. That's all any of us can do. They sat together as darkness gathered, listening to the evening sounds, crickets singing, wind moving through grass, the creek running over stones. Comfortable silence instead of awkward distance. Eliza, Caleb said eventually, you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share, but if you ever want to talk about what brought you here, about Philadelphia or your family or I'll listen. No judgment. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, my father was a surgeon. A good one. He drank himself to death 5 years ago, after my mother passed. I kept his practice running for a while, helping other doctors, but she stopped, and he heard her take a careful breath. A man I trusted betrayed that trust. Badly. There was a scandal. Doors closed. I had nothing left to stay for. The words were simple, but Caleb heard the weight beneath them. Pain and shame and loss that echoed his own. I'm sorry, he said. So am I. But sorry doesn't change the past. It only decides how we carry it forward. Is that what you're doing here? Carrying it forward? I'm trying to put it down, she said quietly, or at least set it aside long enough to build something new. Caleb understood that impulse better than he could say. Then I hope you find what you're looking for here. What about you, Caleb? What are you looking for? He considered the question, surprised by how hard it was to answer. Peace, I think, and a good life for my boys, something stable and real that they can count on. No grand dreams. I had grand dreams once. They're buried in the south field with my wife. The bitterness in his voice surprised him. Now I just want to make it through each day and give my sons a chance at better. Eliza stood, moving to lean against the porch railing, looking out at land that was still strange to her. Maybe that's enough, she said. Maybe grand dreams are overrated, and the real work is in the daily living. Maybe so. She turned back to him, and something had shifted in her expression, determination or resolve. I want to make this work, Caleb, this arrangement, this household. I came here with very little hope, but these past days, I think perhaps I could build something here, if you're willing to let me try. Standing on that porch in the Montana twilight, Caleb felt the careful walls he'd built start to crack. Not breaking, not yet, but allowing light through the spaces between stones. I'm willing, he said. It wasn't a promise of forever. It wasn't a declaration of feeling. But it was honest, and for two people trying to construct a life from broken pieces, maybe honesty was the best foundation they could hope for. Eliza nodded, satisfied. Then we'll take it one day at a time. One day at a time, Caleb agreed. She went inside, leaving him alone with the stars and the vast Montana night. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The creek whispered over stones. The house behind him held three people who were trying, in their own ways, to become something more than the sum of their separate grief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Caleb thought, a start was all you needed to believe the rest might follow. The days that followed James's accident marked a turning point that none of them acknowledged aloud, but all of them felt. Eliza moved through the house with growing confidence, no longer asking permission for small decisions, rearranging the pantry for better efficiency, mending curtains that had hung crooked for months, planting seeds in the neglected vegetable garden behind the house. The boys grew accustomed to her presence, their initial wariness softening into something closer to acceptance. Thomas still watched her carefully, but his questions became less guarded. He asked her opinion on his schoolwork, showed her drawings he'd made, told her rambling stories about things that happened before she arrived. James, his arm healing in its splint, followed her around the house like a devoted shadow, chattering about everything and nothing while she worked. Caleb watched these small transformations with mixed feelings. Relief that his sons were adapting, gratitude that Eliza fulfilled her promises, and beneath it all, a complicated tangle of guilt and hope he didn't know how to name. Some mornings he woke to the smell of coffee already brewing and forgot, just for a moment, that the woman in his kitchen was a stranger he'd hired. Other times he'd turn a corner and see her in Sarah's apron despite her protests, and the grief would hit him fresh and sharp. She never complained, never asked for anything beyond basic necessities. She worked from dawn until the boys were in bed, then retreated to her room where lamplight showed under the door until late hours. What she did in there, Caleb didn't know. Reading, perhaps, or sewing, or simply sitting with her own thoughts. 2 weeks after her arrival, Mrs. Gunderson came calling. Caleb saw the wagon approaching from the north pasture and felt his stomach sink. The mercantile owner was kind-hearted but relentlessly curious, and he'd been avoiding her questions about his mail-order bride since Eliza arrived. Now there'd be no escape. He rode back to the house and found Eliza in the garden, pulling weeds from around young bean plants. She looked up at his approach, reading something in his expression. Company? Mrs. Gunderson from town. She runs the mercantile and knows everyone's business. Understanding flickered across Eliza's face. I see. Should I? Be yourself, Caleb said, surprising himself with the certainty. She'll judge either way. Might as well give her the truth. Eliza stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. She'd abandoned the severe gray dress for something simpler, a blue cotton work dress that had belonged to Sarah but fit Eliza differently, hung differently. Caleb had found it laid out on the kitchen table one morning with a note asking if he minded her altering it for use. He'd written back that she should use whatever she needed. Mrs. Gunderson descended from her wagon in a flurry of skirts and exclamations, her round face bright with curiosity. Caleb Rowan, you've been hiding this poor girl away like a secret. I had to come see for myself that you hadn't made the whole thing up. Mrs. Gunderson, Caleb accepted her enthusiastic embrace with resignation. This is Eliza Moore. Eliza, Martha Gunderson. Mrs. Rowan, surely, Martha corrected, looking between them with raised eyebrows. Or have you not made it legal yet? Caleb started, but Eliza stepped forward smoothly. We've been focused on settling in, she said, extending her hand with calm politeness. But it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Gunderson. Caleb mentioned you've been kind to his family. Martha shook her hand vigorously, studying Eliza with the intensity of someone cataloging details for later gossip. Well, you're not what I expected, I'll say that. Caleb's advertisement made it sound like he wanted a farmhand more than a wife. I am a farmhand, Eliza replied evenly. Among other things, A slow smile spread across Martha's face. I think I like you. Come, let's have tea, and you can tell me all about yourself. Caleb, make yourself useful somewhere else. Caleb opened his mouth to protest, caught Eliza's slight nod, and surrendered. I'll be in the barn if you need me. He retreated but couldn't help glancing back to see the two women heading into the house, Martha's arm linked through Eliza's like they were old friends. Whatever interrogation was about to occur, Eliza would have to navigate it alone. An hour later, Martha emerged looking thoughtful. She found Caleb repairing tack in the barn and settled herself on a hay bale with the air of someone preparing to deliver a verdict. That's quite a woman you've got there. She's capable. Capable, Martha snorted. She's running circles around you is what she's doing. Your house is cleaner than it's been in years. Those boys are better fed. And she managed to deflect every nosy question I asked without being rude about it. That takes skill. Caleb didn't look up from the bridle he was mending. What did you want me to say, Martha? That we're madly in love? We barely know each other. I'm not criticizing. I'm observing. Martha's voice softened. She's got secrets, that one. Pain she's not ready to talk about, but she's genuine in wanting to make this work. I can tell the difference between a woman running from something and a woman running toward something. She's doing both. Aren't we all? Fair point. Martha stood, brushing hay from her skirts. Here's my unsolicited advice, which you'll ignore because you're stubborn. Don't wait too long to make it legal. The arrangement you've got now leaves her vulnerable, and people will talk. They're already talking, but a wedding will give her protection she doesn't have as just a hired woman living in a widower's house. Caleb's hand stilled. He hadn't thought about it that way, about how Eliza's position might appear from outside, how precarious her situation actually was. I'll consider it. Consider it quick. And Caleb? Martha paused at the barn door. Sarah would want you to be happy. She wouldn't want you living in a museum to her memory. The words hit harder than intended. Caleb nodded without speaking, and Martha left him alone with thoughts that circled like vultures. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Caleb found Eliza at the kitchen table with a ledger and stack of receipts. She'd asked to see the ranch accounts the previous week, offering to help with bookkeeping. What she'd found had apparently required serious attention. Your feed costs are too high, she said without preamble. Mr. Henderson is charging you premium prices for standard grain. I can get better rates if I handle the ordering. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down. You know feed costs? I know when someone's being taken advantage of, and I know how to read a contract. She made a notation in the ledger. You're also paying for services you're not receiving. This entry here, barn roof repair from last fall. Was that completed? No, Henderson said he'd get to it come spring. It's nearly summer. Either he needs to do the work or refund the deposit. She looked up at him with those clear winter eyes. You're too trusting, Caleb. People see a widower trying to manage alone and they assume you won't notice the discrepancies. I notice, He stopped, unsure how to explain the exhaustion that made fighting every battle feel impossible. You're stretched too thin, Eliza finished, which is precisely why you needed help. Let me handle the accounts and the suppliers. You focus on the land and the cattle. That's a better division of labor. It made sense. It made so much sense that Caleb wondered why he'd been resisting. All right, the books are yours. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her calculations. Caleb watched her work, the precise way she wrote, the small furrow between her brows when she concentrated. Capable, Martha had said. That didn't begin to cover it. Mrs. Gunderson suggested we should marry soon, he said abruptly. Legally. She said people are talking. Eliza's pen stilled. People will always talk. She also said your position here is vulnerable without legal protection, that I hadn't considered that properly. I accepted those terms when I came. I know, but he struggled to find the right words. It seems I should offer better terms if I can. A legal marriage would give you rights, security. It would make this arrangement more fair. Eliza set down her pen and met his gaze directly. Is that what you want? A legal marriage? I think it's what makes sense, for practical reasons. Practical reasons. Something flickered in her expression. Amusement or disappointment, he couldn't tell. That seems to be our standard. Do you object to it? She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with that unsettling intensity. No, she said finally. I don't object. If we're going to build a life together, we might as well do it properly. But I want to be clear, legal marriage or not, I'm not expecting romance or declarations. I'm expecting partnership. Partnership, Caleb agreed, the word feeling both heavier and lighter than he'd anticipated. When should we? Soon, before the summer work gets too demanding. Small ceremony, just what's required for legality. I'll speak to Pastor Williams in town. Eliza nodded and returned to the ledger. The conversation apparently concluded. But Caleb sat there a moment longer, watching her work, and felt the ground shift beneath him in ways he couldn't quite name. The next Sunday, they rode into town, all four of them in the wagon, the boys bouncing with excitement at the outing, Eliza sitting straight-backed beside Caleb in her mended gray dress. He'd told the boys they'd be making the arrangement with Eliza permanent, and while Thomas had received the news with solemn approval, James had cheered and asked if that meant Eliza would be their ma now. She'll be your stepmother, Caleb had explained carefully, if that's something she's comfortable with. Eliza had knelt down to James's level. How about you call me whatever feels right to you? Some children call their stepmother by her first name. Some choose something else. We can figure it out as we go. Can I think about it? Take all the time you need. The church stood at the edge of town, white-clapboard with a simple cross, surrounded by cottonwoods that provided shade for Sunday gatherings. Pastor Williams was a lean man with kind eyes who'd presided over Sarah's funeral and had watched Caleb struggle through the years since with patient concern. He received the news of Caleb's intention to marry with barely concealed relief. I'm glad to hear it, Caleb. Truly, you've carried alone long enough. He turned to Eliza with warm welcome. Miss Moore, I look forward to knowing you better. Would you like to meet next week to discuss the ceremony? Actually, Caleb said, we were hoping for something sooner and simple. Just the legal words, witnesses, nothing elaborate. Pastor Williams studied them both, reading what was unspoken. I see. Well, if you're certain, I can perform the ceremony next Saturday. That gives you a week to prepare and file the necessary paperwork. That would be fine, Eliza said quietly. Will you want the boys present? Caleb glanced at Eliza, who nodded. Yes, they should be there. They left the church with the date set, and Caleb felt the weight of it settle over him. 1 week until he legally bound himself to a woman he barely knew, formalizing an arrangement born from desperation rather than affection. It should have terrified him. Instead, he felt oddly calm. The boys ran ahead toward the mercantile, and Caleb found himself walking beside Eliza in rare solitude. Having second thoughts? She asked. No, you. No, she paused. Though I should probably tell you, I can't have children. The statement landed between them like a stone in still water. Caleb absorbed it, turning it over in his mind. Because of a fever years ago. The doctors were clear about it. Her voice was matter of fact, but he heard the old pain beneath. I thought you should know before we make this legal. If you wanted more children, if that was part of your expectation, it wasn't, Caleb said honestly. I've got my hands full with the 2 I have, but I'm sorry. That can't have been easy to learn. It wasn't. For a long time, I thought it meant I'd never have a family at all. She glanced ahead at Thomas and James, who were peering into the mercantile window. This, whatever we're building here, it's more than I expected to have. Then we're even. Because you're more than I expected to find. She looked at him with surprise, and he realized it was the first genuinely personal thing he'd said to her. Not practical, not about the arrangement, just honest observation. Before she could respond, James came running back, grabbing her hand. Can we get peppermint sticks, please? Thomas said if we're real good, you might say yes. Eliza's expression softened in the way it did around the boys. I think that could be arranged, but you have to help me carry the supplies out. I will. I promise. They spent the next hour gathering supplies, and Caleb watched Eliza negotiate prices with vendors with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. She was right about Henderson. His prices were inflated, and when Eliza calmly pointed out the discrepancy and threatened to take her business elsewhere, the man backed down with poor grace. On the ride home, Thomas sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, while James dozed against Eliza in the back, sticky peppermint residue on his face. Pa? Thomas said quietly. When you marry Eliza, does that mean we're a real family again? The question caught in Caleb's chest. What makes you think we weren't a real family before? I don't know, it felt broken, like something was missing. Thomas stared at his hands. I know Ma can't come back, I'm not a baby, but it's been just us for so long and we weren't enough to fix the broken parts. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop, needing to address this properly. He turned to his son, seeing Sarah in the shape of his face, seeing himself in the worry lines too deep for an 8-year-old. Listen to me. You and James have never been broken, and you've always been enough, more than enough. The broken parts weren't your job to fix. They were mine, and I didn't handle them well. He gripped Thomas's shoulder. But you're right that Eliza helps. She makes things feel more whole, more balanced. Does that make sense? Thomas nodded slowly. She's not Ma, but she fits anyway. Yeah, she does. They continued home in comfortable silence, and when they arrived, Caleb carried sleeping James inside while Eliza and Thomas unloaded supplies. The evening passed in familiar routine, supper, dishes, the boys' bedtime. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. Later, after the house was quiet, Caleb stepped onto the porch and found Eliza already there, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Too much thinking. He understood that. Want company? She gestured to the space beside her on the steps, and he sat down, leaving respectful distance between them. I've been wondering, Eliza said after a while, what your wife would think of this. Of me. The question surprised him. Sarah was practical above all else. She'd want the boys cared for and the ranch running well. I think... He paused, considering it honestly. I think she'd approve of you. You're nothing like her, but that's not a bad thing. How was she different? Sarah was warm, openly affectionate. She filled rooms with talking and laughing. She never met a stranger. The memories didn't hurt as much as they once had. She was sunshine. You're more like... Storm clouds? Eliza offered wryly. I was going to say steady rain, the kind that soaks in deep and makes things grow. She turned to look at him, genuine surprise in her expression. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in years. Then people haven't been paying attention. They sat with that for a moment, the night settling around them. An owl called from the cottonwoods. The creek whispered its endless song. Caleb, Eliza said carefully, what happened to her? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but I should probably know. He'd known this conversation would come eventually. Pneumonia. 3 years ago, middle of winter. She got sick fast, and by the time I got Doc Pritchard out here, it was already too far gone. The words came easier than they once had. She fought for 5 days. Then she was gone. I'm sorry. So am I, every day. But he struggled with how to say what he'd been learning. Grief isn't what I thought it would be. I expected it to fade, to get lighter. Instead, it changes. It becomes part of you, like a scar. You carry it differently, but it's always there. Yes, Eliza said softly. That's exactly it. You've lost someone too. Several someones. My mother, my father, the life I thought I'd have. She pulled the shawl tighter. And a child I never got to meet. Caleb absorbed that carefully. The fever? I was 3 months along when it hit. I lost them both, the child and the chance of any others. Her voice was steady, but he heard the cost of that steadiness. The man who should have supported me through it chose that moment to reveal he was already married. Apparently I'd been convenient entertainment, not a real prospect. Rage flared hot in Caleb's chest. Yes. It was. But he had position and reputation, and I had nothing. When I threatened to expose him, he destroyed my name instead. Made sure no respectable household would hire me, no decent man would consider me. She laughed, but it held no humor. So here I am, about as far from Philadelphia as I could get, marrying a stranger out of necessity. Not just necessity, Caleb heard himself say. At least, I hope not. She looked at him, question in her eyes. I mean, Yes, the arrangement is practical, but these past weeks watching you with the boys, seeing how you've taken hold here, it's more than I hired you for. You've given us something I didn't know how to ask for. What's that? Hope, I think. The possibility that life could be more than just surviving. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. You've given me something too. A place where my past doesn't define me, where I can be useful and valued for what I do rather than judged for what was done to me. She met his eyes. That's worth more than you might realize. Then maybe we're a fair trade after all. Maybe we are. The week before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and nervous energy. Eliza refused to make a fuss about it, insisting she didn't need a new dress or special arrangements. But Martha Gunderson had other ideas. She arrived 3 days before the ceremony with a dress box and a determined expression. Every woman deserves to feel special on her wedding day, even if it's a practical arrangement, she announced, shooing Caleb out of his own house. Go find something useful to do. We have work here. Caleb retreated to the barn where Thomas found him an hour later. Mrs. Gunderson is bossy, Thomas observed. That she is. But Eliza looks happy. I peeked through the window. That caught Caleb's attention. Happy? She was smiling, really smiling, not the polite kind. Mrs. Gunderson was fussing with her hair, and Eliza was laughing. Thomas leaned against the stall door. I don't think I've heard her laugh before. Neither had Caleb, he realized. And the fact that he'd missed it, that he'd somehow failed to create space for her joy, sat uncomfortable in his chest. Saturday arrived with clear skies and gentle warmth. Caleb dressed in his one good suit, helped the boys into their Sunday clothes, and tried not to think too hard about what he was about to do. This was practical, necessary. It made sense. So why did his hands shake as he fastened his collar? They arrived at the church to find a small gathering, Pastor Williams, Martha Gunderson, and her husband, Doc Pritchard and his wife, a few neighboring families. More people than Caleb had expected, but their presence felt right. Witness to a new beginning. Then Eliza emerged from the back room and Caleb forgot to breathe. She wore a simple dress of pale blue, not white, which would have felt like mockery given the circumstances, but something soft and lovely that made her eyes luminous. Her dark hair was arranged in a way he'd never seen, pinned up with small flowers woven through. Martha's work, no doubt. But it was Eliza's expression that caught him, nervous and hopeful and determined all at once. She walked toward him without music or ceremony, just steady steps that brought her to his side. Up close, he could see the faint tremor in her hands, the quick rise and fall of her breathing. You look beautiful, he whispered, and meant it. You clean up well yourself, she replied. And there, a flash of the smile Thomas had mentioned. Pastor Williams began the ceremony, and Caleb tried to focus on the words. Commitment, partnership, legal binding. But what he heard beneath the formality was something else. Two people standing together despite fear, choosing possibility over safety, building something fragile and real from the ruins of separate grief. When it came time for vows, they'd agreed on the traditional words. Simple. No false promises of love or devotion they couldn't guarantee. But when Caleb took Eliza's hands in his and spoke the words, I, Caleb, take you, Eliza, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he felt the weight of the promise settle deeper than mere legality. This was covenant. This was choosing partnership and trust even when the outcome was uncertain. Eliza's voice was steady when she repeated her own vows, her hands firm in his. I, Eliza, take you, Caleb, to be my lawfully wedded husband. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Pastor Williams smiled warmly. You may kiss the bride. They'd discussed this moment, whether to include it at all. In the end, practicality won. A kiss was expected. Better to get it over with. Caleb leaned in carefully, conscious of everyone watching, and pressed his lips to Eliza's in the briefest contact that could qualify as a kiss. Quick, chaste, awkward. But in that fraction of a second, he felt her breath catch, felt the warmth of her skin, felt something spark that had nothing to do with practicality. They pulled apart quickly, and in Eliza's eyes he saw his own surprise reflected. Then James was tugging at his coat. Are you married now? Really married? Really married, Caleb confirmed, lifting his youngest son up. Does that mean we can have cake? Everyone laughed, and the tension broke. Martha had indeed provided cake, 3 layers of it, decorated with wildflowers. They gathered in the church hall, this small community welcoming Eliza into their fold with genuine warmth. She handled it gracefully, accepting congratulations and answering questions, though Caleb could see the exhaustion building behind her smile. Finally, mercifully, they were released. The ride home was quiet. The boys tired from excitement, Eliza staring out at the passing landscape with unreadable expression. When they reached the ranch, Thomas and James tumbled out of the wagon and ran inside, eager to change out of their good clothes. Caleb helped Eliza down, and they stood in the yard as evening gathered around them. "Well," she said, "we did it. We did. Are you sorry?" "No. Are you?" She considered the question seriously. "No. Frightened, perhaps. Uncertain. But not sorry. That's honest. It's all I have to offer." Caleb looked at this woman, who was now legally his wife, who'd taken his name and his household and his complicated grief, and felt something shift in his chest. Not love. They weren't there yet, might never be. But respect. And beneath that, the first tender shoots of genuine affection. "Come on," he said, offering his arm. "Let's go home." She took it, and they walked toward the house together. Husband and wife-in-law, if not yet in heart, 2 people learning to carry each other's weight, building a future one careful day at a time. Inside, the house was the same as when they'd left it. Same furniture, same walls, same rooms. But somehow, it felt different, more solid, more real. Eliza excused herself to change, and Caleb helped the boys prepare for bed. When he checked on them an hour later, they were both asleep, worn out from the day's excitement. He stood in their doorway watching them. These children who'd lost so much, who'd been so brave about rebuilding. They're good boys. He turned to find Eliza in the hallway, changed back into her work dress, hair down around her shoulders. "They are. You've been good for them." "They've been good for me too." She moved closer, stopping a careful distance away. "This is strange, isn't it? Being married, but not really knowing what that means for us," Caleb finished. "Yes, it's strange. We'll figure it out. Will we? We've managed this far." She offered a small smile. "One day at a time, remember?" "One day at a time," he agreed. They stood in that dim hallway, married strangers who'd promised partnership without knowing quite what they were building. Outside, the Montana night settled over the land. The creek sang. The wind moved through grass. The world continued turning, indifferent to human arrangements and the small hopes they contained. But inside the house, something new was taking root, fragile and uncertain, but growing nonetheless. And sometimes, Caleb thought, as he watched his wife walk toward her own room, sometimes growing was enough. Summer arrived in full force the week after the wedding, bringing heat that shimmered over the grasslands and work that stretched from dawn until well past dark. Caleb had warned Eliza that these months would test them all. Cattle to move, fences to mend, hay to cut and stack before the weather turned. What he hadn't anticipated was how seamlessly she'd integrate herself into the rhythm of ranch labor. She woke before him most mornings, coffee already brewing when he stumbled into the kitchen. By the time he returned from early chores, breakfast would be ready and the boys roused for their daily lessons. Eliza had taken their education seriously, setting aside 2 hours each morning for reading, arithmetic, and writing practice that she supervised with patient firmness. "Education is the one thing no one can take from you," she told Thomas when he complained about practicing penmanship in the middle of summer. "Trust me on that." The afternoons belonged to shared work. Eliza had proven surprisingly capable with animals, overcoming her initial nervousness around the horses to become genuinely useful. She could feed and water the stock, collect eggs from the temperamental hens, and even help with basic veterinary care when needed. More importantly, she could manage the household logistics that had always overwhelmed Caleb, planning meals around available supplies, organizing preservation of garden produce, maintaining inventory of everything from lamp oil to needles and thread. The boys thrived under her steady attention. James had taken to calling her Mama Liza, without anyone suggesting it, the name emerging naturally one afternoon when he'd scraped his knee and run to her for comfort. She'd cleaned the wound, bandaged it carefully, and held him while he cried. And when he'd whispered the name against her shoulder, she'd simply kissed his head and murmured that everything would be all right. Thomas still called her Eliza, but the formality had softened. He sought her opinion on things that mattered to him, showed her treasures he found exploring the ranch, included her in the private world of childhood that had been closed to everyone except Caleb and James for so long. What changed between Caleb and Eliza was harder to define. They were married in law, sharing a name and a household, but still maintaining separate bedrooms and the careful distance of their original arrangement. Yet proximity bred familiarity. Working side by side through long days created an ease between them that felt almost like friendship. He learned small things about her through observation, that she hummed while cooking but fell silent when troubled, that she favored her left hand when tired, that she slept poorly during thunderstorms. She learned his patterns too, anticipating when he'd need coffee or a second pair of hands, reading his moods in the set of his shoulders and adjusting accordingly. They talked more than Caleb had talked to anyone in years. Not deep conversations about feelings or the past, but the practical exchanges of partners who relied on each other. Discussions about which fields to rotate the cattle through, whether they could afford new equipment before winter, how to handle Thomas's growing curiosity about things beyond the ranch. Easy talk that sometimes stretched into evening hours on the porch, both of them too tired to move but content enough to stay. 3 weeks into married life, crisis arrived in the form of James falling ill again. It started with listlessness at breakfast, James pushing food around his plate without eating. By midday he was feverish, and by evening he was burning hot and barely conscious. Eliza pressed cool cloths to his forehead, while Caleb paced the house like a caged animal, memories of Sarah's final illness making his chest tight. "I should ride for Doc Pritchard," he said for the third time. "Not in the dark. The road's too dangerous." Eliza's voice was steady even as she wrung out another cloth. "The fever's high, but not dangerously so. We'll watch him through the night, and if he's not better by morning, you'll go at first light." "What if—" "Caleb." She looked up at him, and her eyes were clear and certain. "I won't let him slip away. I promise you that." The conviction in her voice steadied him. He pulled a chair close to James's bed and settled in beside her, and together they kept vigil as darkness fell and the house grew quiet around them. Thomas appeared in the doorway around midnight, rubbing his eyes. "Is James going to die?" "No," Eliza said firmly. "He has a summer fever, unpleasant but not deadly. Come here." Thomas crept into the room, and Eliza made space for him on the edge of the bed. "Your brother is strong. His body is fighting off whatever made him sick, and the fever is part of that fight. By morning, it should break." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen this before, many times, and I know what dangerous looks like. This isn't it." She touched Thomas's cheek gently. "But I'm glad you're worried. It means you love him." "Of course I love him. He's my brother." "Then sit with us if you'd like. Sometimes sick people heal better when they know they're not alone." So Thomas curled up at the foot of the bed while Caleb and Eliza maintained their watch. The hours crawled by, marked by the steady rhythm of cloth and water, the monitoring of breathing and pulse. Caleb found himself studying his wife in the lamplight, the competent way her hands moved, the calm focus in her expression, the absolute certainty that had pushed back his panic. "You're good at this," he said quietly, not wanting to wake the boys. "I had good teachers. My father believed that anyone could learn to help if they paid attention and stayed calm." She checked James's temperature again. "The fever's starting to come down. Another hour and he should be past the worst." "You weren't worried at all, were you?" "I was terrified," she admitted, surprising him. "Every time one of them gets hurt or sick, I'm terrified. But fear doesn't help them, so I put it aside and do what needs doing." "That's—" Caleb struggled for words. "That's exactly what Sarah used to say." Eliza met his eyes across their sleeping son. "I'm not trying to be her." "I know, but you're filling the space she left, whether you mean to or not. And I'm grateful for it." Something shifted in her expression, a softening that made her look younger. "So am I, more than I can say." James stirred, mumbling something incoherent, and they both turned their attention back to him. By dawn, as Eliza had predicted, the fever broke and he fell into genuine sleep instead of fevered restlessness. Thomas had dozed off at some point, sprawled across the foot of the bed. Caleb found himself watching all three of them, his sons and the woman who'd promised to protect them, and felt something fierce and protective surge in his chest. When Eliza finally stood to make breakfast, exhaustion evident in every movement, Caleb caught her hand. "Thank you," he said simply. She squeezed his fingers briefly before letting go. That's what family does. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Not an arrangement or a transaction, but something real and chosen and worth protecting. The incident seemed to unlock something in their household. In the days that followed, the careful distance between Caleb and Eliza began to close. Not dramatically or all at once, but in small increments that accumulated into change. She started joining him for early morning coffee before the boys woke, both of them too tired for conversation, but comfortable in the quiet. He began helping with dishes after supper, working beside her in the domestic space he'd previously avoided. They fell into patterns of casual touch, his hand at her back when passing in doorways, her fingers briefly on his shoulder when she set down his coffee. Nothing romantic, but no longer strictly professional either. The boys noticed and approved, their happiness at having a complete household showing in relaxed laughter and reduced anxiety. Thomas stopped watching Eliza like he expected her to disappear. James grew bold enough to climb into her lap during evening story time, something he'd been working toward for weeks. One evening, as Eliza read to the boys from a book about frontier explorers, Caleb watched from the doorway and realized with startling clarity that this ordinary domestic scene was what he'd been desperately needing without knowing how to ask for it. Not romance or passion, but partnership and presence. Someone to share the weight of days and the small joys of watching children grow. Later, after the boys were asleep, he found Eliza in the kitchen finishing the last of the cleaning. "Leave it," he said. "You've done enough today." "Just one more." "Eliza." He stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in her face. "You don't have to earn your place here. You've already got it." She set down the dishcloth, studying him with those Winter River eyes. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "I think you're working yourself to exhaustion trying to prove something that doesn't need proving." "Old habits," she said quietly. "I'm used to having to justify my existence." The admission made his chest ache. "Not here, not with us. You could spend tomorrow doing absolutely nothing, and you'd still belong here." "I wouldn't know how to do nothing." "Then let me teach you." He held out his hand. "Come sit on the porch with me. No work, no purpose, just sitting." She hesitated, then placed her hand in his and let him lead her outside. The evening was warm, the sky vast and filled with stars. They settled onto the porch steps side by side, shoulders almost touching. "This is your idea of doing nothing?" Eliza asked after a moment. "This is my idea of remembering why we work so hard, because we get to come home to this." He gestured at the land spread before them, silvered with moonlight. "Because we're building something that matters." "Is it working? The building?" He considered the question honestly. "Better than I expected. You've made this house feel like a home again. The boys are happy. He paused, searching for the right word. "I'm less alone than I've been in years." "So am I," she said softly. "I didn't realize how isolated I'd become until I had people who needed me again." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds. An owl called from the barn. The creek murmured its endless song. The wind carried the scent of sage and grass and possibility. "Caleb," Eliza said eventually, "can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." She was quiet for a moment, gathering courage. "Do you ever regret this? The arrangement? Marrying someone you didn't love?" The question hit deeper than she probably intended. Caleb turned it over carefully before responding. "I don't know what love is supposed to look like anymore. What I had with Sarah was everything the songs and stories promise, passionate and consuming and bright. When she died, I thought that was it, my one chance at that kind of feeling. And now? Now I'm learning there might be different kinds of love, quieter ones, built on trust and partnership instead of passion." He looked at her directly. What we have, it's not what I had with Sarah, but it's real. It matters. And no, I don't regret it. Eliza's eyes were bright in the moonlight. I worried you might, that one day you'd wake up and resent being trapped with someone you settled for. Is that what you think you are? Someone I settled for? Aren't I? No. The word came out fierce, surprising them both. You're someone who showed up when I needed help and became someone I need, period. That's not settling, he struggled for the right word. That's grace, maybe. Or luck. Or just two broken people finding a way to be less broken together. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. No one's ever said anything like that to me before. Then no one's been paying attention. She laughed, but it caught on something that might have been a sob. I'm afraid, Caleb, of getting comfortable here, of letting myself believe this is real and permanent, because every time I've believed in something, it's been taken away. He understood that fear intimately. I can't promise nothing will go wrong. Life's too unpredictable for that, but I can promise I'm not going anywhere. And as long as I'm here, you've got a place here. Even if I can't give you everything a wife is supposed to give, you're giving me what matters: partnership, steadiness, care for my children. That's more than enough. She turned toward him, and in the starlight he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. Without thinking, he reached up and brushed them away with his thumb, the gesture intimate in a way their brief wedding kiss hadn't been. Eliza, he said softly, you don't have to be anything but yourself. That's all I want. What if myself isn't enough? It already is. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, and he felt something in his chest crack open. Not love, not yet. Maybe not ever in the consuming way he'd known before, but something tender and true that felt like its own kind of promise. They sat there in the Montana night, husband and wife, learning to trust the ground beneath their feet, building something neither had planned but both desperately needed. And when Eliza finally stood to go inside, Caleb caught her hand and squeezed it gently. Good night, wife. Good night, husband. The words were still strange in their mouths, but getting more familiar every day. The next morning brought disaster in the form of a broken fence and cattle scattered across 3 properties. Caleb discovered it at dawn, post down, wire tangled, and his best breeding stock mixed with the neighbor's herd 2 miles east. He returned to the house already calculating the work required, finding Eliza and the boys finishing breakfast. We've got a problem, he said without preamble. Major fence break. I need to round up the cattle and fix it before they wander further. What do you need from me? Eliza asked immediately. Can you handle things here? Keep the boys occupied, maybe ride over to the Hendersons and let them know what happened in case any of our stock ended up on their land? Consider it done. She was already moving, clearing dishes efficiently. Boys, lessons are canceled today. Thomas, I need you to help me prepare supplies for your father. James, you're in charge of packing food he can take with him. Both boys jumped into action, and Caleb felt a rush of gratitude for her quick competence. Within 30 minutes, he was riding out with food, water, and the supplies he'd need for fence repair, leaving his household in capable hands. The day was long and brutal. The cattle had scattered wider than he'd initially thought, and rounding them up alone was nearly impossible. By afternoon, he'd managed to gather about half the herd, but exhaustion was setting in and he was no closer to fixing the fence. He was considering riding back for help when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Eliza rode up on Sarah's old mare, looking completely comfortable in the saddle despite her claims of limited experience. She'd changed into men's work clothes, pants and a shirt that must have been his, rolled up at the sleeves and cinched at the waist with a belt. What are you doing here? He asked, surprised and concerned. The boys are with Mrs. Gunderson. I rode to town, explained the situation, and she offered to watch them until we're done. Eliza dismounted smoothly. You can't do this alone, so stop trying. Where do you need me? Relief and admiration flooded through him. You can really ride? I lied about my limited experience. My father kept horses in Philadelphia. I rode most of my childhood. She surveyed the scattered cattle with a practiced eye. Tell me the plan and I'll follow your lead. Working together, they managed in hours what would have taken Caleb days alone. Eliza proved to be an excellent rider and quick to understand cattle behavior. By evening, they had the herd gathered and secured in a temporary pen, and the fence repairs were well underway. They worked past sunset, Caleb holding posts while Eliza hammered, both of them covered in dust and sweat and too tired to talk. When the last wire was finally stretched tight and secured, they stood back to survey their work in the fading light. "That should hold until I can do proper repairs," Caleb said. "It's good work." Eliza wiped her forehead, leaving a streak of dirt. "We make a decent team." "Better than decent." He looked at her, this woman who'd ridden out to help without being asked, who'd worked alongside him for hours without complaint, who'd somehow known exactly what he needed before he knew himself. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." "Oh, partnership, remember? Your problems are my problems now." They rode back in darkness, too exhausted for conversation but comfortable in the quiet. At the Gundersons, they found the boys already asleep on the parlor sofa, Martha standing watch like a benevolent guardian. "About time you two got back," she said, but her tone was warm. "Those boys were worried sick until I convinced them you were fine. Don't wake them. I'll help you load them into the wagon." Caleb carried James while Martha helped Thomas stumble sleepily out to the wagon. Eliza thanked her profusely, promising to return the favor, and Martha waved it off with typical generosity. The ride home was quiet, both boys dozing against Eliza while Caleb guided the horses through familiar darkness. When they finally reached the ranch, he carried each boy to bed while Eliza saw to the horses. Another task she'd claimed she couldn't do, but clearly could. They met in the kitchen afterward, both too tired to maintain pretenses. "I should clean up," Eliza said, looking down at her filthy borrowed clothes. "Me too, but I don't think I can move." She laughed, the sound loose and genuine. "Same." They stood there in the lamplight, covered in the evidence of shared labor, and something passed between them, recognition, maybe, of what they were becoming. Not strangers anymore, not quite lovers, but partners in the truest sense, bound by more than law or convenience. "You were amazing today," Caleb said. "The way you just took charge. Knew what needed doing and did it. So were you. The way you handled everything, kept calm even when it seemed impossible." She met his eyes. "This is the first time in my life I've felt genuinely useful. Not decorative or convenient, but actually necessary." "You are necessary, to this ranch, to the boys." He paused, then pushed through the vulnerability. "To me." Her breath caught. "Caleb, I know this wasn't supposed to be romantic. I know we agreed to keep things practical, but I need you to know—" He stepped closer, driven by something he couldn't name. "You matter. What we're building here matters, and I'm grateful every day that you got on that stage and came here." Eliza's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm grateful too. More than I can say." They stood inches apart, both aware of the shift happening between them, the careful boundaries beginning to dissolve. Caleb raised his hand slowly, giving her time to step back, and cupped her cheek. She leaned into the touch, eyes closing briefly. "We should probably get some sleep," she whispered, but she didn't move away. "Probably," he agreed, but neither of them moved. The moment stretched, charged with possibility and restraint. Then Eliza opened her eyes and stepped back carefully, breaking the spell. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eliza." She walked away and he let her go, but something had fundamentally changed. The walls they'd built between partnership and something more were crumbling, and neither of them seemed interested in rebuilding them. In the days that followed, the shift became more pronounced. They touched more often, hands meeting over shared tasks, shoulders brushing in passing, small contacts that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Conversations grew more personal, delving into hopes and fears beyond practical matters. They laughed together more easily, the humor between them flowing natural and warm. The boys noticed and thrived on it, their happiness at seeing the adults in their lives comfortable with each other showing in everything from improved appetites to better sleep. Thomas started asking Eliza to tuck him in at night alongside Caleb. James began automatically including her in his plans and pronouncements about the future. One evening, as Eliza read to the boys before bed, James interrupted with a question that made everyone still. "Mom Eliza, do you love us?" The room went quiet. Thomas looked up sharply, suddenly alert. Caleb, standing in the doorway, held his breath. Eliza set down the book and looked at both boys with complete honesty. "Yes," she said simply. "I love you both very much." "Like a real mama?" James pressed. "I don't know what a real mama's love feels like from the mama's side," Eliza admitted. "But I know that I wake up every morning glad you're here. I know that when you're hurt or sad, my chest aches. I know that watching you grow and learn makes me happier than anything else in my life. If that's what a real mama feels, then yes. Like a real mama." James threw his arms around her neck, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas did the same. Caleb watched his wife hold his children and felt his own eyes burn. Later, after the boys were asleep, he found Eliza in the kitchen making tea with shaking hands. "That was," he started. "Too much?" she finished, not looking at him. "I shouldn't have said it so plainly. I should have been more careful." "It was perfect." He moved close enough to see the uncertainty in her face. "They needed to hear it, and I think you needed to say it." "I didn't plan to love them," she whispered. "I was supposed to care for them, help raise them, but I wasn't supposed to fall in love with them?" She nodded, tears spilling over. "What if something happens? What if this all falls apart and I have to leave? How will I survive losing them?" Caleb pulled her into his arms without thinking, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his shoulder. He held her while she cried, one hand rubbing her back in slow circles. "Nothing's going to happen," he murmured against her hair. "You're not going anywhere. This is your home, they're your children," and he stopped himself before finishing that thought, but Eliza pulled back to look at him. "And what?" The question hung between them, loaded with everything they'd been carefully not saying. Caleb looked at this woman who'd come to him as a transaction and become something infinitely more precious, and made a choice. "And you're my wife. Not in name only anymore. Not just on paper. You're my partner and my friend and—" He cupped her face in both hands. "And I'm falling in love with you." Her eyes went wide with shock. "But you said—" "We agreed." "I know what we agreed. I know this wasn't part of the plan, but plans change, Eliza. Feelings change. And I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just gratitude or respect or partnership." He brushed away her tears with his thumbs. "I love you, simply and truly, and I needed you to know." She stared at him, emotions warring across her face. "I don't know how to do this, how to trust this. Every time I've loved someone, they've left or betrayed me or died. I don't know how to believe this is real." "Then let me believe it for both of us until you're ready. No pressure, no demands, just let me love you, at whatever pace you can handle." "What if I can't love you back? Not the way you deserve?" "You already do," he said gently. "The way you care for my sons, the way you've made this house a home, the way you rode out in the middle of a crisis to help me. That's love, Eliza. Maybe not the dramatic kind, but it's real, and it's enough." She searched his face, looking for doubt or deception, and finding only honesty. Slowly, tentatively, she rose on her toes and kissed him. Not the brief, awkward press of lips from their wedding. This was real, soft and questioning, and full of the fragile hope of two people choosing trust over fear. Caleb's hand slid into her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and Eliza melted against him with a small sound that went straight to his heart. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "Me too. But I want this. I want you. I want this family we're building. Then we'll be terrified together." She laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "That's the best offer I've had in years." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the taste of her trust. When they finally separated, she took his hand and laced their fingers together. "Should we?" She gestured vaguely toward the bedrooms. Caleb understood what she was asking and what she wasn't ready for. "Not tonight. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'll figure it out together, but there's no rush." Relief and gratitude flooded her expression. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being patient, for seeing me, for—" Her voice caught. "For choosing me." "Always," he promised, "for as long as you'll have me." They stood in that quiet kitchen, two people who'd married as strangers and were becoming something beautiful through choice and work, and the slow building of trust. Outside, the Montana summer night wrapped around their house, crickets singing their endless song. And inside, in the warm glow of lamplight, Caleb Rowan held his wife's hand and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like the future might hold something more than just survival. It might hold joy. The confession changed everything and nothing all at once. In the days that followed, Caleb and Eliza moved through their routines with the same steady partnership they'd developed over months. But now there was an undercurrent of tenderness that colored every interaction. A hand lingering on a shoulder, eyes meeting across the dinner table and holding. Small smiles shared over the boys' heads that spoke of private understanding. They still kept separate bedrooms, both agreeing without discussion that some transitions needed time. But the space between them grew warmer, more charged with possibility. Caleb found himself looking for excuses to be near her, and Eliza no longer pulled away when he touched her in passing. The boys sensed the shift and bloomed under it. Thomas grew bolder in showing affection, hugging Eliza goodnight without prompting. James climbed into her lap at every opportunity, secure in the knowledge that he was welcome there. The house filled with laughter that had been absent for years, the sound of a family learning to be whole again. 3 weeks after their kitchen confession, a letter arrived that threatened to shatter their fragile peace. Caleb found it in the mail bundle from town, a cream envelope addressed to Mrs. Eliza Rowan in elegant script that looked expensive and Eastern. He handed it to her during breakfast, watching her face go pale as she recognized the handwriting. "What is it?" he asked, concern immediate. "Nothing, just someone from Philadelphia." Her hands trembled as she set the letter aside unopened. "I'll read it later." But she didn't. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter all day while Eliza moved through her tasks with visible tension, glancing at it periodically, like it might bite. By evening, Caleb's concern had grown into worry. "Eliza," he said gently, finding her in the garden as the sun set. "Whatever that letter says, we'll handle it together. But you need to read it." She sat back on her heels, dirt on her hands and anxiety in her eyes. "What if it's bad news? What if someone's found me and wants to drag me back into—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Then we'll deal with it, together." He offered his hand. "Come inside. I'll sit with you while you read it." In the kitchen, with the boys occupied upstairs and lamplight casting soft shadows, Eliza finally opened the letter with shaking hands. Caleb watched her face as she read, seeing emotions flicker across her features: shock, disbelief, grief, and finally something that looked like relief. When she finished, she set the pages down carefully and met his eyes. "It's from my father's attorney, the one decent man who didn't abandon me after the scandal." Her voice was steady but fragile. "He's been trying to find me for months. Apparently, when my father died, there were assets I didn't know about, properties that were held in trust, investments he'd kept separate. The attorney has been settling the estate, and—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "There's money, Caleb. A significant amount. Enough to—" She trailed off, but he heard what she wasn't saying. Enough to make her independent. Enough that she wouldn't need this marriage for security anymore. "Enough to what?" he asked quietly, his heart hammering. "Enough to change things. If I wanted them changed," she looked at him directly. "The attorney needs me to come to Philadelphia to sign documents and settle the estate properly. He says it could take several weeks." The thought of her leaving, even temporarily, made Caleb's chest tight. "When?" "As soon as possible, before the legal window closes." She reached for his hand. "Come with me, all of us. Make it a family trip." Relief flooded through him. "You want us to come?" "I don't want to go alone, and I don't want—" She squeezed his fingers. "I don't want to give you any reason to think I'm running away, that I'm choosing money over this life we're building." "I wouldn't think that." "Wouldn't you? Even a little?" Her eyes were honest, requiring honesty in return. Caleb considered it carefully. "Maybe a small part of me would wonder. Not because I don't trust you, but because I know what it's like to be afraid of losing something good." "Then come with me. Meet the attorney, see where I came from, help me close that chapter properly so I can fully commit to this one." She paused. "And if you can't leave the ranch that long, I understand. I'll go alone and come back as quickly as possible." "The ranch can wait," Family comes first. The words felt right, settled, and sure. We'll all go. The boys will love seeing the big city, and He pulled her closer. I want to see the world you left behind. Understand who you were before you became mine. Ours, she corrected softly. Before I became ours. They spent the next week preparing for the journey. Caleb arranged for a neighboring rancher to watch the property and tend essential chores. Eliza packed efficiently, teaching the boys about the adventure ahead while managing their excitement. Letters were sent confirming their arrival date, travel arrangements made through the expanding railroad network that had made crossing the country a matter of days instead of months. The night before their departure, Caleb found Eliza on the porch, staring at the mountains she'd come to love. Nervous, he asked, settling beside her. Terrified. Philadelphia holds nothing but bad memories. Walking back into that world, even temporarily, she shuddered. What if I see him, the man who destroyed my reputation? Then I'll be there beside you, and he'll have to face the fact that you survived his cruelty and built something beautiful. Caleb took her hand. You're not the same woman who left. You're stronger now. You have people who love you and need you. He can't touch that. But she leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her. What if the city reminds me of what I gave up? What if I start to resent the ranch and this simple life? Is that what you're really afraid of? That you'll want to stay in Philadelphia? No. The answer was immediate and fierce. I'm afraid that I'll realize how much I've changed, and I won't recognize myself anymore. That the woman I was and the woman I've become are so different I won't know how to reconcile them. Then don't reconcile them. Let the old Eliza rest in peace and be the new one fully. There's no shame in transformation. She was quiet for a long moment. When did you become so wise? When I married a woman who challenged me to be better than my grief. He kissed the top of her head. Come on, early start tomorrow. We should get some sleep. That night, for the first time, Eliza knocked softly on his bedroom door instead of retreating to her own room. Caleb opened it to find her standing in the hallway in her nightdress, vulnerability written across her face. I don't want to sleep alone tonight, she said quietly. I'm too anxious about tomorrow, and I want to be close to you. He stepped back without hesitation. Come in. She entered his room, their room, in the house's original design, for the first time since arriving months ago. It was sparse and masculine, holding little of Sarah's memory except the bed itself. Eliza stood in the center looking uncertain until Caleb pulled back the covers in invitation. They climbed into bed together, and he gathered her close, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. She fit perfectly there, like she'd been designed for that exact space. Just sleeping, she whispered. I'm not ready for... I know, this is perfect. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. Sleep, Eliza. I've got you. She relaxed against him, and within minutes her breathing had evened into sleep. Caleb lay awake longer, marveling at the trust she'd shown in coming to him, and allowing herself this vulnerability. The woman who'd arrived so guarded and careful had opened herself to love despite every reason not to. He tightened his hold on her, silently promising to prove worthy of that trust. The journey east was an adventure that delighted the boys and tested everyone's patience in equal measure. Thomas and James had never seen a train before, and their excitement was infectious even during long hours of travel. Eliza pointed out landmarks and told stories about the changing landscape, her nervousness gradually giving way to the pleasure of sharing this experience with her family. Caleb watched her with the boys and saw what she'd said was true. She'd transformed from the brittle, careful woman who'd stepped off the stage into someone softer and more open. Motherhood and love had gentled her edges without diminishing her strength. Philadelphia appeared through the train window on a humid August afternoon, brick and smoke and crowds that made Montana seem impossibly remote. The boys pressed against the glass in wonder while Eliza's expression grew more tense with each mile. The attorney had arranged lodging at a respectable hotel near his office. Their rooms were clean and comfortable, if uncomfortably small after the ranch's open spaces. That first evening, they ventured out for dinner, and Caleb saw Eliza navigate the city with practiced ease that spoke of her origins here. She knew which streets to take, how to handle the noise and crowds, the subtle rules of urban society that were foreign to him. You belonged here once, he observed as they walked back to the hotel, the boys tired and stumbling between them. I survived here, she corrected. I never belonged. Not really. I was always too sharp-edged, too direct, too interested in medicine and business instead of proper feminine pursuits. She smiled slightly. Montana suits me better. Wide open spaces for sharp edges. The next morning they met with the attorney, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Ashford, who greeted Eliza with genuine warmth and Caleb with careful assessment. Mrs. Rowan, I'm so pleased you received my letter, and this must be your husband and stepson's. He shook Caleb's hand firmly. Your wife spoke highly of you in her correspondence. She mentioned me? Caleb asked, surprised. Extensively. She wanted me to understand her new circumstances before releasing any information about the estate. Ashford gestured them into his office. Boys, there are books and toys in the corner if you'd like to occupy yourselves while we discuss business. Over the next hour, Ashford laid out the details of Eliza's inheritance with careful precision. Her father had been more successful than she'd known, investing wisely in properties and businesses that had continued generating income even after his death. The total sum, once everything was liquidated and transferred, would be substantial, enough to buy several ranches or live comfortably without working for years. The question, Ashford said, is what you'd like to do with it. I can arrange investment portfolios, property transfers, trusts for the children, whatever serves your family's needs. Eliza looked at Caleb, deferring the decision. He squeezed her hand and addressed the attorney directly. This is Eliza's inheritance, her father's legacy. I won't presume to make decisions about it. He turned to his wife. What do you want to do? She was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully. I want to invest most of it, create security for our future and the boys' education, but I'd like to keep some liquid for ranch improvements. New equipment, perhaps hiring help so Caleb isn't carrying all the physical labor alone. She paused. And I'd like to donate a portion to establish a fund for women in difficult circumstances. Women like I was who need a fresh start but lack the means. Pride swelled in Caleb's chest. That's perfect. Ashford nodded approvingly. I can arrange all of that. It will take a few weeks to finalize the paperwork and transfers. Will you be staying in Philadelphia that long? Eliza glanced at Caleb, question in her eyes. He understood what she was really asking. Could he bear to stay in this city that far from home, or did he need to return to familiar ground? We'll stay, he said. See the sights. Let the boys experience the city. Make it a proper trip. Relief flickered across her face. Thank you. The next 2 weeks became an unexpected gift. Free from ranch responsibilities for the first time in years, Caleb relaxed into the role of tourist and father. They took the boys to museums and parks, showed them the harbor where ships came from around the world, introduced them to foods and experiences impossible in rural Montana. Eliza blossomed in this context, showing them her city with growing confidence. She took them to her father's old surgery, now occupied by another doctor who remembered her and welcomed them warmly. She showed them the library where she'd spent countless hours, the market where she'd learned to bargain, the small corners of the city that had given her joy. But she also showed them the shadows. Walking past certain neighborhoods, her spine would stiffen and her hand would find Caleb's. He never asked, just held tight and kept moving, understanding that some ghosts didn't need naming. On the 10th day, the ghost found them. They were leaving a restaurant after lunch when a well-dressed man emerged from a shop directly in their path. He was handsome in a practiced way, his clothes expensive, his bearing confident. But when he saw Eliza, shock and something uglier crossed his face. Eliza? Eliza Moore? His eyes traveled to Caleb and the boys, and his expression curdled. Well, I'd heard rumors you'd fled west, but I didn't believe them. This is quite the transformation. Eliza's face had gone white, but her voice was steady. It's Eliza Rowan now, and you need to move aside. Rowan. The man's smile was cruel. How convenient. Did you tell your husband about our history, about what you were when... He didn't finish because Caleb stepped forward, putting himself between the man and his family. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He simply looked at this overdressed fool with the kind of cold contempt that made the man step back. My wife's past is her own to share, or not share, Caleb said quietly. What I know is that she's the finest woman I've ever met, and if you speak another word to her, I'll forget we're in polite company. Do you know what I know everything that matters. Now walk away before I make you. Something in Caleb's expression, perhaps the years of hard labor that had made him strong, or the absolute certainty in his eyes, convinced the man to retreat. He sneered once more and disappeared into the crowd. Eliza was shaking. Caleb turned to find her pale and struggling for composure while the boys watched with wide, confused eyes. Thomas, take your brother to that vendor across the street and buy whatever candy you want. Caleb handed over coins. We'll meet you there in a minute. The boys hurried off, and Caleb pulled Eliza into an alcove away from the busy street. She collapsed against him, trembling. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry you had to see that, had to hear. Stop. He cupped her face, making her look at him. I don't care what he thinks he knows about you. I don't care what lies he spread or what reputation you supposedly had. I know who you are. I live with you every day. I see how you love our sons, how hard you work, how strong and kind and capable you are. That's the truth of you. Everything else is just noise. But he'll tell people he saw me, that I'm married now, and nothing. Let him tell whoever he wants. We're going back to Montana in a few days and never seeing these people again. Their opinions don't touch us. She searched his face, looking for doubt or disgust and finding only solid certainty. You really mean that? Every word. That man is nothing. His judgment is nothing. You are everything. He kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her mouth, gentle and reassuring. You are my wife and my partner and the mother of my children, and I'm proud to stand beside you anywhere. She buried her face against his chest and cried while he held her, letting the poison of that encounter drain away. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear. I love you, she said. I don't think I've said it plainly yet, but I do. I love you, Caleb Rowan, completely and truly. His heart stuttered. Say it again. I love you. She smiled through tears. I love you. I love you. I love you. He kissed her deeply, not caring who might see, pouring everything he felt into that connection. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you too. More than I thought possible. Can we go home soon, back to Montana? As soon as the paperwork is done. I'm ready to leave this place behind. They collected the boys, sticky with candy and oblivious to the drama, and spent the rest of the day deliberately avoiding any places where they might encounter familiar faces. That evening, after the boys were asleep in the adjoining room, Eliza came to Caleb's bed again. But this time, when he held her close, she turned in his arms to face him. I'm ready, she whispered, for all of it, for being your wife in every way. Caleb's breath caught. Are you sure? Because there's no rush, no pressure. She silenced him with a kiss, deeper and more urgent than any they'd shared before. I'm sure. I love you. I trust you. And I want this. I want us to be fully married. Eliza. Her name was Prayer and Promise as he pulled her closer, and whatever else he might have said was lost in the tender urgency of finally, fully, becoming one. The remaining days in Philadelphia passed quickly. Ashford finalized the paperwork, transferring funds and establishing accounts with efficient professionalism. Eliza signed documents that secured her inheritance and set up the charitable fund she'd envisioned. By the time they boarded the train west, everything was settled. The boys fell asleep within an hour of departure, exhausted from farewell adventures. Caleb and Eliza sat together in the growing dusk, watching the city fade behind them. Any regrets? Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders. None. That life is done. This is where I belong now, with you, with the boys, in Montana. She laced her fingers through his. The money is useful, but it's not what matters. What matters is going home. Home, Caleb echoed, savoring the word. I like how that sounds. Me too. They rode west through changing landscapes, from dense cities to rolling farmland to endless prairie, and with each mile, Eliza seemed to breathe easier. By the time the mountains appeared on the horizon, she was radiant with anticipation. When the ranch finally came into view, both boys pressing against the windows in excitement, Caleb felt his own chest expand with something he finally recognized as uncomplicated happiness. This was home. This was family. This was the life he'd built from grief and desperation, transformed by the woman beside him into something worth celebrating. They tumbled out of the wagon into golden afternoon light, the boys racing to check on their favorite spots while Caleb and Eliza stood together surveying their land. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rowan," he said, kissing her temple. "Welcome home, Mr. Rowan," she replied, and her smile was everything, joy and relief and love and the deep satisfaction of knowing exactly where she belonged. That evening, after the boys were settled and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch watching stars emerge over familiar mountains. Eliza leaned against Caleb's shoulder, his arm secure around her waist, both of them content in ways that had seemed impossible months ago. "Caleb?" Eliza said softly. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing past my fear, for being patient while I learned to trust, for loving me even when I couldn't love myself." She turned to look at him. "For giving me a family and a home and a life worth living." "You gave me all that too. You saved us, Eliza. The boys and me both. We were drowning in grief and loneliness, and you threw us a rope." "We saved each other," she said firmly. "That's what family does." He kissed her, soft and sure, tasting home and hope and the promise of years stretching ahead. When they pulled apart, her eyes were bright with tears that had nothing to do with sadness. "I'm happy," she whispered, like the words were miraculous. "For the first time in so long, I'm genuinely happy." "So am I," Caleb replied, and meant it with his whole heart. They sat together as darkness fell and the Montana night wrapped around them. Two people who'd married as strangers and become everything to each other through patience and work and the brave choice to love despite fear. The house behind them held sleeping children who would wake to another day of security and care. The land around them held possibilities yet to be discovered. And in each other's arms, Caleb and Eliza held the simple, precious truth that sometimes the best things in life aren't planned or expected. They're found in the courage to say yes to second chances and the wisdom to recognize grace when it arrives disguised as necessity. Autumn arrived with a gentleness that felt like benediction, painting the Montana landscape in shades of amber and gold. The ranch settled into the rhythm of harvest season, gathering hay, preparing for winter, ensuring everything was secure before the snow came. But this year was different from all the ones that had come before. This year, the work was shared, the burdens lighter, the house filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove. Caleb watched his wife move through their home with a confidence that still amazed him. She'd stopped asking permission months ago, making decisions about the household and ranch with the authority of someone who knew she belonged. The inheritance had allowed them to hire 2 ranch hands for the heavy labor, freeing Caleb to focus on management and spend more time with his family. It was Eliza's idea, and like most of her ideas, it had transformed their lives in ways he hadn't anticipated. The boys thrived under their combined attention. Thomas had grown 3 inches over the summer, shooting up so fast they'd had to let out all his pants twice. He was reading at a level far beyond his age, devouring books Eliza ordered from catalogs and discussing them with her for hours. James had lost 2 teeth and gained a puppy, a border collie pup that Caleb brought home one afternoon and watched his youngest son fall completely in love with. "What should we name him?" James had asked, holding the squirming black and white bundle. "That's your choice, son," Caleb had replied. "He's your dog." James had considered seriously, then looked at Eliza. "What do you think, Mama?" The casual use of the name still made her eyes shine. "How about Scout? He's going to help you explore and keep you safe." "Scout?" James had repeated, testing it. "I like it. Scout it is." Now, 2 months later, Scout followed James everywhere, the two of them inseparable, watching them play in the yard while Eliza prepared dinner and Thomas helped Caleb with evening chores. The picture of their life felt complete in ways Caleb had never dared hope for. But completion, he was learning, didn't mean the absence of challenges. On a crisp October morning, Martha Gunderson arrived unannounced with news that would test everything they'd built. "There's a family coming through town," she announced without preamble, accepting coffee at the kitchen table. Woman and 3 children, heading west after losing their husband and father to fever. "She's desperate, Caleb, completely out of money, children half-starved, and winter coming on. I've been asking around for someone who might take them in, at least temporarily." Caleb glanced at Eliza, reading her expression. They talked about this, about how they might help others the way help had been extended to them. The charitable fund was one thing, but direct action was another. What's she proposing to do once she reaches wherever she's going? Eliza asked. That's the problem. She doesn't have a destination. She was following her husband's dream of land out west, but without him, she's lost. Martha's voice softened. Her oldest is barely 12. The youngest is 3. They need shelter and time to figure out next steps. Bring them here, Eliza said immediately. Caleb turned to her in surprise. Eliza, we have the space. We have the resources now. And we know what it's like to need help and have someone extend it. She met his eyes steadily. If we don't help when we can, what are we building here? He saw in her face the woman who'd once been desperate enough to marry a stranger who understood the terror of having nowhere to go. How could he argue with that? All right, he agreed. Bring them here. We'll figure it out. Martha's relief was visible. Bless you both. I'll fetch them this afternoon. After she left, Caleb found Eliza already rearranging rooms in her mind, planning how to accommodate their unexpected guests. We can put the mother in the spare room upstairs, she was saying, more to herself than him. The children can share the room next to it. We'll need more bedding, more food supplies. Eliza. He caught her hand, stilling her anxious planning. Are you sure about this? It's going to be chaos with 7 people in this house. I'm sure. This family needs help, and we can give it. Isn't that what love does? It expands to make room for more? He pulled her close, marveling at her generous heart. When did you get so wise? When I married a man who taught me that second chances are worth giving. They spent the afternoon preparing, and by the time Martha returned with their guests, the house was ready. The woman who climbed down from the wagon looked worn to transparency, thin and exhausted, her dress mended in a dozen places, her eyes holding the hollow desperation of someone who'd reached the end of her resources. The children clustered around her like frightened birds, all of them pale and underfed. Mrs. Brennan, Martha said gently, this is Caleb and Eliza Rowan. They've agreed to take you in until you can make other arrangements. The woman's face crumpled. I can't. We don't have money to pay you. I can work. I'm strong. I can earn our keep, but no payment necessary, Eliza said firmly, stepping forward. You're not hired help. You're guests who need shelter. Come inside. You must be exhausted. Over the next hours, the story emerged in fragments. Margaret Brennan had been following her husband William West when fever struck their wagon train. He'd died within days, leaving her alone with 12-year-old Catherine, 8-year-old Peter, and 3-year-old Rose. They'd limped into town with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a wagon they'd had to sell for food. I didn't know what else to do, Margaret whispered, holding sleeping Rose in her arms. We had no family back east, no money for passage home even if we did. I thought about trying to find work in town, but no one wants to hire a woman with 3 young children. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Eliza said gently. You're safe here. The children are safe. Take some time to rest and recover, and we'll help you plan next steps. That night, with the Brennan family settled in their rooms and the house quiet again, Caleb found Eliza on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the chill. You did a good thing today, he said, sitting beside her. We did a good thing. You didn't hesitate when I suggested it. How could I? You were right. This is what we should be doing with what we've been given. He paused. Though I admit I'm wondering how long temporary might turn into. Does it matter? We have the room, the resources. If she needs to stay through winter, she stays through winter. And if she needs to stay longer, Eliza was quiet for a moment, considering, then maybe we help her build something here. There's land available near the Henderson property. If she wanted to homestead, we could help her get started. Give her a real chance at independence instead of just charity. Caleb looked at his wife with renewed admiration. You've thought this through. I've lived it. I know what it's like to be dependent on someone else's charity, how that feels even when it's kindly meant. Margaret needs more than a roof over her head. She needs a future. If we can help her build that, we should. Over the following weeks, the Rowan household transformed into something larger and more complex than before. Margaret proved to be a capable, hard-working woman who insisted on earning her keep despite Eliza's protests. She took over much of the cooking and cleaning, freeing Eliza to focus on the children's education, now expanded to include Catherine and Peter alongside Thomas and James. The children adapted with the resilience of youth. Catherine, serious and protective of her siblings, gradually relaxed under Eliza's patient attention. Peter and James became fast friends, getting into the kind of mischief that made Caleb simultaneously exasperated and grateful for the sound of boyish laughter. Little Rose attached herself to Eliza like a shadow, following her everywhere and calling her Auntie Liza with perfect trust. Thomas struggled more with the changes. He'd grown accustomed to being the oldest, the most responsible, and Catherine's presence challenged that position. Caleb noticed his son withdrawing, growing quiet and sullen in ways he hadn't been since Eliza first arrived. One evening, Caleb found Thomas in the barn, supposedly doing chores, but really just sitting on a hay bale, staring at nothing. "Want to talk about it?" Caleb asked, settling beside him. "About what?" "About why you've been avoiding the house lately." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Everything's different now. It's loud all the time, and there's always people everywhere, and Mama Liza doesn't have as much time for me anymore." Caleb's heart ached. "You're feeling pushed aside." "I know I shouldn't. I know they need help, and it's the right thing to do, but, Thomas's voice cracked. "I liked it when it was just us, our family. Now it feels like they're taking over." "Come here." Caleb pulled his son close. "Listen to me. Nothing and no one could ever push you aside. You're my son, and Eliza's son in every way that matters. The Brennans being here doesn't change that. But she's always busy with them, because they need more help right now. They're still finding their feet, but that doesn't mean she loves you less or values you less." He tilted Thomas's face up. "Have you told her how you're feeling?" "I didn't want to seem selfish." "Feelings aren't selfish, son. They're just feelings. And Eliza would want to know if you're hurting." Caleb stood, extending his hand. "Come on, let's go talk to her together." They found Eliza in the kitchen finishing dishes, and Caleb simply said, "Thomas needs to talk to you." Understanding flashed in her eyes. She dried her hands immediately and led Thomas to the porch, leaving Caleb to finish the dishes. Through the window, he watched his wife and son sitting close together on the steps. Eliza's arm around Thomas's shoulders as he talked. Whatever he said made her pull him into a tight embrace, and when they finally came back inside, Thomas's eyes were red, but his expression was lighter. "We're going to have special time every week," Eliza announced. "Just Thomas and me. Maybe we read together, or take a ride, or work on a project. But it's our time, no interruptions." "And James gets the same," Thomas added quickly. "Fair is fair." "Fair is fair," Eliza agreed, ruffling his hair. "I'm sorry I didn't notice sooner that you were feeling overlooked. That won't happen again." The simple acknowledgement seemed to be what Thomas needed. Over the following days, he emerged from his shell, even beginning to warm to Catherine as they discovered shared interests in books and horses. Meanwhile, Margaret and Eliza spent long hours discussing options for the future. Caleb listened as his wife laid out possibilities: the available land, what it would take to establish a homestead, how the community might support a woman farming alone. "I can't ask you to do that much," Margaret protested. "You've already done more than anyone should expect." "You're not asking, we're offering. And you wouldn't be farming alone. You'd have neighbors, including us. People who would help when you needed it." Eliza's voice was firm. "You deserve a chance to build something for your children. Let us help you do that." In late November, with the first snow already dusting the mountains, they rode out to survey the Henderson property that was available for homesteading. It was good land, a creek running through it, timber for building, meadows suitable for crops and grazing. Margaret stood in the center of it with tears streaming down her face. "I could build a life here," she whispered. "A real life for my children." "Then let's make it happen," Caleb said. "We'll help you file the claim and start building before winter sets in too hard. Come spring, you'll have your own place." The months that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Using Eliza's inheritance, they hired additional workers to help build a cabin on Margaret's land before the weather turned too severe. The community rallied around the project with typical frontier generosity, neighbors donating materials, time, and expertise. By mid-December, a sturdy cabin stood ready for occupation, small but solid, with a good stove and tight walls. The day they helped Margaret move into her new home was bittersweet. The children had become so integrated into the Rowan household that separating them felt like tearing family apart. But it was the right thing. Margaret needed independence, and the Brennan children needed to know they had their own home. "You'll visit constantly," Eliza said firmly, hugging Margaret goodbye. "You're not getting rid of us that easily. We're neighbors now, which means we're family." "I can never repay what you've done for us," Margaret said, crying. "You don't repay family. You pass it forward when you can." Eliza kissed her cheek. "Build a good life, Margaret. You deserve it." As they rode away, leaving the Brennans settling into their new home, James asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Are we going to help other people too, like we helped Mrs. Brennan?" Caleb glanced at Eliza, saw her slight nod, and answered honestly. "I expect we will, when we can. Is that all right with you boys?" "I think it's good," Thomas said thoughtfully. "It's nice having people to help." "Even when it's hard?" Caleb pressed. "Especially when it's hard," Thomas replied, sounding older than his 9 years. "That's when it matters most." Winter settled over the ranch with quiet beauty, wrapping everything in snow and peace. The house felt spacious again with just the 4 of them, though they missed the Brennan children's energy. But Margaret and her family visited often, and the Rowans reciprocated, building the kind of neighborly bonds that defined frontier life. Christmas arrived with simple celebration, a tree decorated with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments, gifts that were practical and heartfelt, a dinner shared with the Brennans and the Gundersons and other neighbors who'd become dear friends. As Caleb looked around his table at faces bright with laughter and love, he felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. This was what he'd been building toward without knowing it, not just a household or a marriage of convenience, but a family in the truest sense. People bound together by choice and love, who showed up for each other in crisis and celebration, who made room for more instead of closing ranks. On Christmas night, after the guests had departed and the boys were asleep, Caleb and Eliza sat together in front of the fire. She was curled against his side, his arm around her shoulders, both of them drowsy and content. "Did I ever tell you," Caleb said softly, "that when you first arrived, I was terrified I'd made a terrible mistake?" "You hit it well." "You did too. Were you terrified?" "Absolutely. I thought I was walking into another trap, another situation where I'd be used and discarded." She tilted her head to look at him. "I never imagined this, that I could be this happy, this secure, this loved." "Neither did I. I thought love was something that happened once if you were lucky, and I'd already had my chance." He kissed her forehead. "I'm glad I was wrong." "So am I." She was quiet for a moment. "Caleb, I have something to tell you." Something in her tone made him pull back to see her face. She was smiling, but there were tears in her eyes. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words didn't register immediately. When they did, shock rendered him speechless. "But you said, the doctors said—" "I know what they said, but apparently they were wrong, or my body healed somehow, or it's a miracle, I don't know. But I've been to see Doc Pritchard, and he confirmed it. I'm about 3 months along." Caleb stared at his wife, trying to process this impossible news. A baby. After everything she'd been told, everything they'd accepted, there was going to be a baby. Are you healthy? Is the baby healthy?" "Doc says everything looks good so far. I'm older, and given my history there are risks, but he's cautiously optimistic." Her hand found his, squeezing tight. "I'm scared, Caleb. Terrified something will go wrong, but I'm happy. Is that all right?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her as carefully as spun glass. "Of course it's all right. I'm happy too, and terrified and amazed, and—" His voice broke. "You're going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." "We are." She was crying now, but smiling through it. "I never thought I'd get to say those words. After losing the first one, after being told it was impossible, I never let myself hope. But here we are, hoping anyway." They held each other in front of the fire, two people who'd married without love and found it anyway, who'd thought their family was complete and were learning it could expand, who'd been given second chances and were brave enough to take them. The pregnancy progressed through winter into spring with remarkable smoothness. Eliza bloomed under Caleb's protective care, though she rolled her eyes at his tendency to hover. The boys were thrilled at the prospect of a sibling, already arguing over names and making plans to teach the baby everything they knew. Margaret proved to be an invaluable neighbor, checking on Eliza regularly and offering advice born of her own experience with 3 children. The community rallied around them with typical frontier generosity, preparing gifts and offering support for the birth to come. In early May, on a morning so beautiful it seemed designed for new beginnings, Eliza went into labor. Doc Pritchard arrived within the hour, calm and competent. Martha Gunderson came to manage the household and keep the boys occupied. Caleb stayed at Eliza's side despite her protests that he should leave, holding her hand through each contraction and whispering encouragement. "I can't do this," she gasped at one point, exhausted and frightened. "You can. You are. You're the strongest person I know." He wiped sweat from her forehead. "Just a little longer, love. Just hold on." The birth was long and difficult, testing everyone's nerves. But as evening painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, a baby's cry finally filled the house, strong and insistent, declaring its arrival to the world. "It's a girl," Doc Pritchard announced, placing the squalling infant on Eliza's chest. "Perfect and healthy. Congratulations." Caleb stared at his daughter, red-faced and furious, with dark hair plastered to her head and tiny fists waving, and felt his heart expand impossibly. She was real. She was here. She was theirs. "She's beautiful," he whispered, touching one impossibly small hand. "She's perfect," Eliza agreed, tears streaming down her face. "Our miracle baby." They let the boys come in to meet their sister, both of them awed into unusual silence by the tiny person in their mother's arms. "What's her name?" Thomas asked softly. Caleb and Eliza had discussed this, finally settling on the name that felt right. "Hope," Eliza said. "Her name is Hope, because that's what she represents, that good things can come from broken places, that love can create miracles, that it's never too late for new beginnings." "Hope Rowan," Thomas tested. "I like it." "Me too," James whispered, touching his sister's hand with gentle reverence. "Hi, Hope. I'm your big brother James. That's your other big brother Thomas. We're going to take care of you." Caleb watched his family, his wife exhausted but radiant, his sons already devoted to their new sister, this tiny person who shouldn't exist but did, and felt peace settle over him like a benediction. This was what they'd been building toward, not perfection, but something real and true and worth every moment of fear and uncertainty. A family forged from loss and hope, held together by choice and love and the daily decision to show up for each other. Summer arrived with its usual demands, but this year they faced them as a complete family. Hope thrived, growing strong and healthy despite the early fears. She had Eliza's eyes and Caleb's stubborn chin, and both boys were completely besotted with her. Margaret's homestead flourished with their continued support and her own determination. Catherine had become Thomas's closest friend, the two of them spending hours reading together or exploring the countryside. Peter and James remained inseparable, their friendship deepening with each passing season. Little Rose treated Hope like a living doll, always wanting to help care for her. One August evening, nearly a year and a half after Eliza first arrived, Caleb stood on his porch watching the sun set over land that had been his burden and was now his joy. Inside, Eliza was singing softly to Hope while the boys finished their lessons. Down the road, smoke rose from the Brennan cabin where Margaret was making dinner for her own family. In town, the charitable fund Eliza had established had already helped 3 more families find their footing in the territory. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Eliza, Hope sleeping against her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling beside him. "How far we've come. How none of this was what I planned, but all of it is better than I imagined." He put his arm around her, careful not to disturb the baby. "I was just surviving before you came. Now I'm living." "We're living," she corrected, "building something that matters." "Do you ever regret it? Taking the chance on a stranger's advertisement? Coming all this way to marry someone you didn't know?" She considered the question seriously. "I regret the circumstances that made it necessary. But the choice itself? Never. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Even with the chaos and the hard work and the complications, especially with those things, They're proof that we're really living, not just going through motions. She kissed Hope's head gently. This family, this life, it's messy and complicated and perfect. I wouldn't change a single thing. Thomas and James burst out the door at that moment, Scout barking at their heels, both boys declaring they'd finished their work and could they please go fishing before dark. Go, Caleb said, laughing, but take care of each other. We will, they chorused, already running toward the creek. Caleb and Eliza watched them go, two boys who'd been shaped by loss but hadn't been broken by it, who were learning that love could expand to include more people instead of being diminished by sharing. We did good, Eliza said softly. We did, Caleb agreed, and we're not done yet. No, she said, smiling. We're just getting started. As darkness fell over the Montana ranch, wrapping everything in stars and possibility, the Rowan family settled into evening routines that were ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Dishes were washed, children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses. The house was secured for another night. Small rituals that meant everything because they were shared, because they represented the life that had been built from broken pieces and desperate hope. Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, Caleb held his wife close and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From strangers bound by necessity, to partners bound by choice, to lovers bound by something deeper than either had expected, they'd traveled an impossible distance while remaining in one place. I love you, he whispered into her hair. I love you too, she replied, the words as natural as breathing now. Outside, the creek sang its endless song. The wind moved through grass and cottonwoods. The land stretched vast and beautiful under stars that had witnessed every moment of their transformation. And inside the house built on loss and rebuilt with love, a family slept peacefully, safe, whole, and exactly where they belonged. The story that had started with an advertisement and a desperate gamble had become something neither could have written alone. It had become their life, their love, their legacy. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth every struggle. And in the morning, they would wake to another day of work and laughter, and the small joys that accumulate into a life well lived. They would face whatever challenges came with the same partnership that had carried them this far. They would continue building, expanding, making room for more love instead of less. Because that was what family did. That was what love meant. Not the dramatic passion of stories and songs, but the steady devotion of showing up day after day, choosing each other again and again, building something that would outlast them both. This was their second season, and it had bloomed into something beautiful. This was their second chance, and they had seized it with both hands. This was their life. Messy, complicated, hard-won, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. And it was just beginning.